Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into something really fundamental if you want to speak English more confidently, more fluently.
Absolutely. It's all about getting that rhythm, that kind of musicality.
Exactly. That makes English sound. Well, like English, we're tackling word stress. You know, how some syllables get more punch. And specifically, how prefixes and suffixes, those little bits you stick on the start and end of words, how they shake things up.
Yeah, it's one of those things that might seem a bit random at first, but honestly, once you get the patterns, it makes such a difference.
Right.
Mastering word stress helps you sound, well, more natural. It definitely improves your clarity so people understand you better.
Yeah, clarity's huge.
And it's also key for actually understanding native speakers, you know? So this deep dive, it's really about unpacking those patterns.
And giving you some practical ways to practice, right? Things you can actually use.
Exactly. Actionable stuff.
Okay, perfect. So we've looked at the material and pulled out the main ideas. Let's start with the basics, though. What is word stress? Because it's not just about volume, is it?
Oh, not just volume. It's more like giving one syllable a bit of a spotlight.
A spotlight. Okay.
You say with a bit more force, maybe slightly higher pitch, or you hold it just a fraction longer.
Yeah.
Take a word like hospitality. You don't say hospitality all flat.
Right.
It's hospitality. You hear that T-A?
Hospitality.
No.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You can feel the emphasis on TA.
That's word stress.
And you mentioned sometimes it actually changes the meaning of the word. That seems important.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The classic example is record.
Okay.
If I say record, stress on the first syllable, record, what comes to mind?
Like a vinyl record.
Yeah.
Or maybe like setting a world record, a noun.
Exactly, a noun. But if I shift the stress, record, stress on the second syllable.
Record. That's the verb. Like to record this conversation.
Precisely. Same spelling, record. But the stress tells you if it's the thing or the action. Record versus record.
Wow. Okay. One little syllable doing a lot of work there. So for someone listening, someone learning English, why is this worth focusing on? How does getting stress right actually, help you?
Great question. It feels like a detail, but the impact is big. First off, clarity.
Okay, clarity.
When you hit the right syllable, you're emphasizing the core of the word. It makes it much easier for listeners to follow you, even if maybe your pronunciation of other sounds isn't perfect yet.
Right, it kind of anchors the word for the listener.
Exactly. Then there's rhythm. This is huge.
Rhythm.
Yeah, English isn't like, say, Spanish or French, where syllables get roughly equal time. We're a stress-timed language.
Stress-timed, meaning?
Meaning the rhythm flows between the stress syllables. Those get the beat. The unstressed ones, they get kind of squeezed in between.
Wow. Okay.
So getting the stress right helps you fit into that natural English flow. You avoid sounding, well, maybe a bit robotic or choppy.
Gotcha. More natural flow.
Yeah.
Less like reading a list.
Exactly. And the third big thing, comprehension. Your own listening skills.
How does stressing words right help me listen better?
Because your brain starts to anticipate. You develop an ear for where the stress should be in English words. This helps you identify words faster, segment the speech stream, basically understand what you're hearing more easily. It's a two-way street, helps your speaking and your listening.
Okay, so clarity, rhythm, comprehension. Makes sense why this is foundational for speaking more fluently. Now let's get into the tricky part, prefixes and suffixes. How do these additions affect the stress? Let's start with prefixes, the bits at the beginning.
Right, prefixes. They're interesting because often the most common ones, they don't actually grab the main stress.
You just sort of attach quietly.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Think about prefixes like un, re, in, ir, dis, super common ones.
Okay.
Usually when you add these, the main stress just stays put, right on the original word, the root.
So like happy, stress is on HAP, add un.
It becomes unhappy. Stress is still on HE.
Right.
Happy or right becomes rewrite. Stress on right.
Rewrite, okay.
Possible becomes impossible. Same deal. Irregular, disagree. The prefix is unstressed. The original stress stays.
That's actually pretty helpful. So a lot of common prefixes just leave the stress alone. Is that always the case, though, or are there some bossy prefixes?
Yes, there are definitely some stress hogs, as you put it. A few prefixes do tend to pull the main stress on to themselves.
Which ones should we watch out for?
The ones often mentioned are pre, pro, and sub.
Pre, pro, sub.
Okay.
Right? Example.
Sure, take the word you, add pre. You got it.
Preview. Stress on PRE.
Exactly. Preview or historic becomes prehistoric.
Prehistoric, yeah, I hear it.
With pro, think of active, becomes proactive, or mote becomes promote.
Proactive, promote,
Right.
okay, and subject.
Submarine. the stress jumps right onto that prefix.
Subject, submarine. Got it.
Yeah.
So with pre, pro, sub, the prefix itself gets the main emphasis.
That's the pattern. The prefix becomes the loud part, and the rest of the word kind of follows along, maybe a bit less strongly.
Okay, cool. So most prefixes are chell, but pre, pro, sub, like the spotlight. Now let's flip it. What about suffixes? The endings like ing, ickiness, ingable.
Suffixes, yeah, they behave a bit differently again. We can roughly put them into two camps.
Camps.
Yeah, those that are sort of stress neutral, they don't change the stress.
The easy ones.
The easy ones, and then those that do shift the stress around.
Okay, let's do the easy ones first. Stress neutral suffixes. Which ones are they?
Common ones include inable, inifable, olimal, nefix, emiment, hulles. There are others, but these are good examples.
So adding these doesn't move the stress.
Generally, no. Take comfort. Stress on calm.
Comfort, right.
Add edible, it becomes comfortable. Stress stays on calm.
Comfortable, okay.
Same for visible.
Yeah.
Visible, add edible, still visible. Or happy to happiness, to enjoyment, help to helpless.
Happiness, enjoyment, helpless.
Wow, okay, so you can just tack those on without worrying about stress moving. That's nice. It is a relief. Makes things a bit simpler.
Okay, but now for the other camp.
Yeah.
The stress shifters. These are the ones that cause the headaches, probably.
They can if you're not aware of them, yeah. These suffixes have a strong pull. They either take the stress themselves, which is less common, or they force the stress onto the syllable right before them.
They pull the stress backwards.
Often, yes. Onto the preceding syllable.
Which suffixes do this? Give us the list.
Okay, key ones to listen for are things like swetch, slush, sweatish, animation, summation, cementation, simiation, simiminiatrus, animagity. When you see these, think stress shift likely.
Okay, animation, cinemation, animation, intermation, animatity, enamgematity, animergy. Let's hear it in action. How does it work?
All right, take geography. You have that endomerishianing. The stress lands just before it. Geometography.
Geomination. Ah, okay. Not geography.
Or climate.
Right.
Add enver, it becomes climatic. Stress before the emer.
Climatic, okay. What about animation and shinimation?
Same idea. Convert ends up as conversion. Converse becomes convidation. Stress moves to the syllable right before that antiveran or tantive animation.
Conversion, conversation. Got it. So the stress jumps back one spot. Does that hold for the others too? Like gay to see, sede, k titility.
Yes, that's the general pattern. Democrat becomes D-M-O-C-D. Stress before messacy.
Democracy.
Active becomes actidity. Before attidity, activity.
Biology is biology before biology.
Biology. Okay. So that rule, stress the syllable before these strong suffixes. That seems really useful for longer words.
It's a very powerful pattern, yeah. Helps unlock a lot of pronunciations.
Speaking of longer words, what happens when they get really long? 4, 5, 6 syllables. Is there still just one main stress? Seems like it might sound a bit flat.
Good point. In longer words, you often get what's called secondary stress.
Secondary stress, like a backup stress.
Kind of. You still have the main primary stress, the loudest one. But there's usually another syllable somewhere else that gets a weaker but still noticeable emphasis. More than the totally flat syllables.
Okay. Can you give an example?
Sure. Think of informational, long word. The main stress, the primary one, is on MA, informational. Informational.
Right.
But listen closely. Informational. Hear that little extra bump on N at the beginning.
Informational. Oh, yeah. I do hear that. And N gets a little something. That's secondary stress.
That's it. It's not as strong as MA, but it's stronger than for or emation or L.
Why do we have that? What's its job?
It really helps with the rhythm of long words. Stops them sounding like one long monotone drone.
Right.
It helps break the word up, makes it easier to process, easier to say without stumbling, maintains that stress-timed beat.
And is there a rule, like where does this secondary stress usually show up?
Well, it's not quite as fixed as primary stress, but a common tendency is for it to fall about 2 syllables before the primary stress. 2 syllables before. So on N for emotional, MA is primary, and N is 2 syllables before. That fits.
Exactly. It's a useful guideline to listen for. Doesn't always work, but often does.
I remember seeing something about clapping this out to feel it.
Yes. The clapping method is great for this. You do a loud clap for the primary stress and a softer clap for the secondary stress.
Loud clap primary, soft clap secondary.
Right. So for IN, for emotional, soft clap on IN, no clap on for, loud clap on MA, no claps after. Soft. Loud.
Soft IN, quiet for a loud MA, quiet tearing. Quiet. I can see how that would help train your ear and, your mouth muscles.
It really does. Builds that physical sense of the rhythm.
Okay, that soft loud clap thing sounds very practical. Now, we've got these patterns for prefixes, suffixes, secondary stress, but English pronunciation, it's never that simple, is it?
No, we have to talk about the exceptions and, of course, regional variations.
Ah, yes. The rule breakers and the different accents.
English just loves having exceptions. And how people stress words can definitely vary depending on whether they're, say, in the US, the UK, Australia.
Can you give an example of a regional difference in stress?
Sure. A common one is words ending in "ile," like versatile.
Okay, versatile?
In American English, you'll usually hear versatile, stress on the first syllable.
Yeah, versatile. Got it.
But in British English, it's often versatile, stress shifts to the second syllable.
Versatile versus versatile. Wow, yeah, that's quite different. Same word, different stress.
It happens. Another area is words ending in enchery, like budgetary. Americans often stress the second syllable, budgetary. British English might stress the first, budgetary, or sometimes even later, depending on the word.
So there isn't always one single right way worldwide. Good to know.
Definitely worth remembering. And then there are just words that seem to ignore the patterns we just talked about.
The rebels.
The rebels, exactly. Like photographical, it has that enteral ending, which often pulls stress back. But here, it's photiographical. Stress on to.
Photographical. Okay, weird.
Or original.
Yeah.
Based on origin. You might expect original, but no, it's original.
Original, right.
And casualty ends in enterity, which often puts stress before it, like activity. But this one is casualty.
Casualty. Huh. Okay, so patterns are helpful, but they're not foolproof.
Exactly. They are tendencies, strong ones often, but not universal laws, which leads to the best advice.
Let me guess, check a dictionary.
You got it. When in doubt, especially with a tricky or long word, pull up a good online dictionary that has audio and shows the pronunciation, usually with a little mark for the stress to syllable.
That's solid advice.
Okay.
Okay, so we've covered the what, the why, the patterns with prefixes and suffixes, secondary stress, the exceptions. Let's bring it home. What can listeners do, like right now, to actually get better at this? Practical steps.
Right, the practical stuff. The good news is there are concrete things you can do. First, and maybe most importantly, listen and repeat.
Active listening.
Very active. Use online dictionaries with audio. Watch pronunciation videos. Listen carefully to native speakers in conversations, movies, podcasts. Like this one. Pause. Mimic the stress pattern exactly.
Listen, pause, copy. Got it. What else?
Record yourself speaking. This is so powerful.
Oh yeah, hearing yourself back can be illuminating.
It really can. Compare your stress patterns to a native speaker's. Your own ears will often pick up the differences.
Good one. And we mentioned the clapping.
Yes, the stress clapping. Loud for primary, soft for secondary, great for internalizing the rhythm. Do it out loud.
Okay. What about those words like record?
Minimal pair drills. Practice them back to back. Record, export. Really focus on shifting just the stress. It trains control.
Minimal pairs for stress. Makes sense. And for the long words.
Chunking helps. Break them down using secondary stress as a guide. Find the main beat. Primary. Find the secondary beat and practice saying it in those chunks. In for emational, no.
Okay. I think the material also mentioned making lists.
Yeah, that's a great active learning technique. Make lists of words with those stress-shifting suffixes like mepritation, mecorality. Look up the stress, mark it on your list, and practice saying them.
Or reading aloud, maybe.
Definitely. Take a short text or dialogue, go through and mark the stress on the important or longer words first, then read it aloud, focusing on hitting those stresses.
And stress dictation, what was that?
That's where you listen to someone say a word or a short sentence, and your only task is to write down which syllable got the main stress. It purely trains your ear to identify it.
Ah, focusing just on hearing the stress. Okay. Lots of different angles to practice from.
Exactly. It's about engaging with stress actively, not just passively knowing the rules. Listen for it, mark it, say it, clap it.
It really sounds like mastering word stress, especially with these tricky prefixes and suffixes, is less about rote memorization and more about tuning your ear and practicing the physical production.
That's a great way to put it. It takes conscious effort for sure, but the payoff is huge in sounding more natural and ultimately speaking more fluently.
So, key takeaways. Most common prefixes, usually unstressed.
Right. But watch out for pro, suffixes. They often grab the stress.
And suffixes. Some are neutral, like supinableness.
But others, like exhalation, septatity, often pull the stress onto the syllable right before them.
Use those as your main guides. And listen for secondary stress in long words.
And always,
Right.
if unsure, check a reliable dictionary.
Perfect. Put those practical tips into action. Listen, record, clap, drill. Consistency is key.
It really is. It builds that muscle memory and confidence over time.
Okay, so as you go about your week, listening to English, practicing your speaking, here's a final thought to chew on. Next time you hear an unfamiliar word, don't just focus on the sounds. Try to pinpoint which syllable is stressed. See if that gives you a clue, even before you know the meaning.
Ooh, interesting. Using stress as a listening clue.
Yeah. And also, think about this. When you deliberately practice putting stress on the right syllable in a word, notice how it doesn't just change that word. See if it starts to change the rhythm, the flow of your entire sentence. Does it give your English more of that natural bounce we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Something to experiment with.